live in Minnesota. It's illegal to hunt deer over bait. But there are counties in Wisconsin, just across the river, where it's not only legal to hunt deer over bait, but it's actually the norm. And this is just the very tip of the hunting regulations iceberg. In some states, you can't hunt turkeys in the afternoon. Other states are happy to let you hunt until sunset. In Illinois, you can't shoot a turkey out of a tree before 7 a.m. But at 7:01, that's totally legal. In Texas, you can shoot a turkey with an air gun, but only the Rio Grande subspecies of turkey. It's illegal to shoot an eastern subspecies of turkey with an air gun. You see what I'm getting at here? As you cross state lines, hunting regulations change often in seemingly illogical ways. And this has sort of become a joke among hunters. We laugh at these weird, obscure laws that our game agencies put into place, and we cite them as clear signs of dysfunctional bureaucracy. But here's the thing, this is kind of our fault. Hunters, not to mention the general public, cannot seem to agree on what makes up ethical hunting practices. And for the most part, state regulators try to respond to the demands of the people, and then when they do, you get this crazy quagmire of hunting regulations that we have today. This week, I'm talking to Christine Peterson, who has waded deep into the rabbit hole to try to figure out why in the hell we have such differing hunting laws across state boundaries. Hey, Christine, so how did you get wrapped up in reporting about hunting ethics and regulations?
Last summer, I became interested in the concept of ultra running and hunting. So this movement to go farther and deeper, and a lot of athlete hunters, and how that intersects with hunting and how those two things are mixing. And in those interviews, I came across a guy named Mike Wolfe who was trying to persistence hunt, which is essentially running an animal to exhaustion and then killing it with a bow or some other legal means. It's not a new concept. There was a book that was a bestseller, Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. There's also another one, Why We Run, that also dealt with persistence hunting and podcasts and a variety of bizarre YouTube videos on the topic. But I felt like Mike was a unique one to talk about because his background was hunting. He was raised by an outfitter, a native Montana guy. He had hunted his whole life, but also a professional athlete. So in the Venn diagram of people who are hunters and people who are athletes and could conceptually actually run down the fastest land mammal in North America, it's a pretty small slice of folks. And he was one of them. So I went along to see what it was all about in person and on the ground. And that led to then this discussion of ethics and regulations.
So when you were out there with Mike, watching him run after these antelope, what did that look like?
I mean, in reality, the day that we were there, which was in the high 80s, so hot, but not in the hundreds, it seemed like he didn't have a chance.
Fucking flats.
They all went straight over this hill and out that way.
Typical.
Could you see me on the ridge? I could. You were one ridge over from me, and they were like running away from you down the hill.
Did they get back with another bigger group?
I think they rejoined a group. Yeah.
We walked out into the prairie, and there were a bunch of antelope, and they let us get as close as they were going to let us get because that's how they essentially hide with distance, right? They see you, you see them, and he got about as close as they were comfortable with, which was maybe 200 yards, something like that, and they ran. And they stopped, and they waited till he got closer, and then they ran. And it didn't seem like it was going to happen necessarily on that particular day. We certainly had plenty of conversations about conceptually if it could work and sort of how it could work.
I mean, this shit, like, I just feel like they can fucking run it all day long. Mm-hmm. And it's 80 out, then they're gonna lose you at some point. But like if it's over 100, I feel like it might just put them over the edge just enough where they can't do their normal thing, where then you just keep dogging them, until they finally really have to push themselves hard and then one of them blows up. I just haven't ever had the chance to actually have temps that hot to see whether I can do it or not.
And for it to actually work, how would that play out?
First off, he would have to isolate a pronghorn. One of the ways that they have evaded predators is they all sort of run together, and there's all these different groups of pronghorn that then will come together and intermix and then spread out into other groups, and you have to choose an animal because as they spread out, then they can rest. So one group can go off to the east or whatever and can get some rest. And so he'd have to pick out one, and then he would have to follow that one until it just couldn't keep running. So his idea was to just keep going at a 6-minute, 7-minute mile pace, somewhere in there, faster if he needs to, over the course of, 20 plus 30 miles over the course of a day, slowly following that one individual. And then at the point that the animal can't run anymore, he would then shoot it with a bow that he was running with and carrying.
And that's why the strategy is just like try to stick with one group as long as you can. I mean, I don't know. Those ones were splintering when we were out there on our own, but we did stick with that one group for a while. I just figured I'd try to stay with them. God damn it, I should have known they were going to circle back.
In some ways, this could be seen as a pretty brutal hunting tactic. When you were out there with Mike, running around, did it feel like what he was doing was unethical hunting?
So, I mean, it is brutal for sure. And he acknowledges that. I mean, that's a brutal way for an animal to die. But it didn't seem unethical in terms of people who run animals down with snow machines or four-wheelers or something like that, which in many places is illegal and unethical. But I mean, this is a human on two legs trying to run down the fastest land mammal in North America, which can run 60 miles an hour. And humans can't run 60 miles an hour. And so it was, in some ways, it seemed like the fairest chase, right? He was walking out there and presenting himself to the antelope, and they were responding. And that was, listening to him talk about what he was trying to do was also partly why I wanted to see it and spend some time with him, because he was so thoughtful, because this wasn't a weird quirk that he had sort of decided to do over beers with a buddy and then gone out and drunkenly done in the desert. Like, this is something that he has thought about and worked at for a lot of years. And at one point on one hunt some years ago, he did get close enough to a pronghorn, not to shoot it, but he said there's a point where for a long time they're just running back and forth and they are not all that bothered by you because they're fast and they know they can get away. And then he had an animal that he had been following for a while, and he said it stopped and it looked at him, and they essentially made eye contact. And he could see that it realized that this was serious, that this wasn't a goofy guy running around doing some weird human thing, that this was a real problem. And that was when he felt like he had this incredibly deep connection with the wild, that he was really truly interacting with the prey that he was chasing, which to some degree is what we all do as hunters, is interact with. I mean, that's part of the reason we hunt, and we don't just buy all our meat at the grocery store, right? So that we can have this interaction with the wild. And that was what he got in a pretty damn intimate way.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things, I think, from the story to me was how he framed it, in that in any other type of hunting, you're trying to trick the animal. You're either trying to decoy it in or call it in, or you're hiding and trying to ambush it. This is the opposite of that. He's just letting the animal know that he's there, and it's ultimately just a test of endurance.
Right. And so, I mean, like most of the reporting I've done over the years, it was a fascinating topic that's been going on possibly as long as humans have existed, and people are clearly still trying to do it now. So I wanted to know more.
We'll be right back after the break. Okay, so you write this story with Mike Wolfe. The story runs. And what was the feedback like when it published?
Depending on who was offering that feedback, it got pretty negative. People were really upset.
Yeah, I have one single comment from our social media feed that I think pretty much sums up the criticism that we got. And I quote, "This is some unethical bullshit. Why would you publish this garbage?" What do you think people were so unhappy about with the story, or what do you think that they possibly missed?
That comment was an interesting one, partly because I'm not sure the role of journalism is to exclusively publish stories about people doing things that other people think are ethical. But that's, a discussion for another day. But I do think, people were upset at how brutal this seemed, and potentially thought that this was something that was very callous and that he wasn't thinking about the well-being of animals. And a lot of people were upset about what this said to the non-hunting public, what this showed because of the brutality. One of the main takeaways was, we don't have to hunt like that anymore. So should we actually be hunting like that now? And that's an interesting discussion to be had. And that's a discussion that can be had in the world between archery and rifle hunting too. But those were some of the main points, was just how brutal it seemed.
Okay. So from here, because you started calling around to folks who work in hunting ethics and hunting regulations, right? Like, these folks do this as a profession, not just as a hobby on social media. So what did they have to say in your interviews?
Yes, I did call a lot of people, because I've spent a lot of years writing about wildlife and hunting and the outdoors, and have a number of people that I can call to have these sort of thought projects with. And the response from wildlife professionals was largely, first, that biologically it didn't matter. A number of them said that because there are so few people in this country that can actually do this, even sort of, that it doesn't matter from a population standpoint. Some others made the point that the disruption caused to running pronghorn in August on their feet didn't come close to the disruption to antelope of opening day of antelope season. I've lived in Wyoming my whole life and have spent a lot of days opening day antelope season, and there's hundreds, thousands of people flooding areas, chasing around herds, not chasing them, but hunting. And when you have that many people in the prairie hunting antelope,
right,
a species that uses distance to keep them safe, they're running around a lot. But then that also led us to this discussion of how hunting regulations are then made, because everyone said, look, this is legal.
Our definition of hunting is, hunting means chasing, driving, flushing, attracting, pursuing, worrying, following.
This is Tony Boudreau, head of wildlife for Idaho Fish and Game.
Or on the trail of, shooting at, stalking, or lying in wait for any wildlife, whether or not such wildlife is then or subsequently captured, killed, taken, or wounded. So clearly, it's what you're talking about fits within the definition of hunting. It is a type of hunting that is not a common practice in North America.
And so by and large, in terms of how hunting regulations are made, they come from biology and the common law of the area, which we can talk about later if you want. And then also what people have decided they think is fair or ethical. And that is this gray area of, what seems okay or not.
So before we dive fully into the gray area, what is the common law of the area?
That idea is that what people have sort of done for a long time in that area, maybe what is the culture of that place, then becomes law, because that's what people are used to, and that's what people have decided is okay. There are areas where hunting deer with dogs is legal and fine, and people do that and it's accepted. And there are areas like Wyoming where that is not okay. And people get really upset at the idea of that.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But there are also some regulations that get made because kind of outstanding or strange circumstances, right? Like there will be an issue that comes up that just seems really wrong, and there will either be, pressure from the public or from hunters or from legislators to try to create some legislation to stop that from happening again, or from to prevent that sort of scenario from being encouraged. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how do we get some of these strange, odd laws on the books?
Yeah, for sure. I think the best example that I found in calling around about this story is a rule from Idaho, which is that you can't hunt big game with a rifle that weighs more than 16 pounds, which is not a law we have in Wyoming, or a law in Montana, or I'm guessing a law in many other places. And it's because there were apparently some non-resident hunters in the early 80s who were hunting bull elk in northern Idaho, sort of the canyons of northern Idaho. And one guy had a custom rifle built in the caliber 50 BMG, and it was mounted on a tripod with a seat, also mounted on a tripod. And he had a guy next to him with a set of binoculars that the biologist told me looked like something out of the Navy. And the guy with the binoculars was calling shots across the canyon. And the warden that was out there that saw what was going on said, they were killing bull elk across the canyon. And it would have taken them 2 days to get to where those animals were shot, which at that point, at best you're hauling out antlers, but you're not getting any salvaged meat from that. And people were really outraged. And then shortly after, the Idaho Fish and Game Commission decided this was going to be their rule, that you couldn't hunt with a rifle weigh more than 16 pounds. And that's how you were going to avoid having something like that happen.
Wow.
Some of the interesting ones, too, are bear hunting. So in Wyoming and in Idaho, you can hunt bears over bait, and in Montana, you cannot. But in Idaho and Montana, you can hunt bears with dogs. In Wyoming, you can't. And in Montana, it was actually not legal to hunt bears with dogs until this year. It had been illegal for 100 years or something like that, until the legislature, so the Montana lawmakers, changed that this year and allowed bear hunting with dogs. And I asked the director of Game and Fish here why it wasn't legal to hunt bears with dogs, because you can hunt lions with dogs in Wyoming. And he said that, it's come up before, and the commission has discussed it, and people have come and talked about it, and there's just never really been a desire to change it. So those are the rules. And that's sort of how, one of the ways anyway, that you get these differing regulations state by state.
Yeah, because just for a little context, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, they're of a same type of hunting state. It's not like comparing Wyoming and Georgia, that have vastly different, game species and hunting traditions and the terrain even. So at that point, it just kind of becomes an issue of hunter opinion and culture, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And that differs. There's technology differences that people have decided are and aren't okay. In Idaho, you can't have any electronics on your bow or rifle, but other states you can. And a lot of that it just comes down to what the hunting public, and in some cases non-hunting public, wants.
Yeah. So about that, how much of this, regulatory stuff is decided based on the non-hunting public opinion? In other words, how much do regulators factor in the idea that there might be some tactics or gear out there that the general public just isn't going to understand, and they need to regulate so that hunting doesn't look bad to the general public?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can't speak exactly to how much of that's going on, but there's a great example in New Mexico right now, which is the legislature just approved a ban of trapping on public lands, and largely out of a concern for wildlife well-being, and then also the increasing number of dogs and pets getting caught in traps. But that's something that the non-hunting, particularly non-hunting public, was just not okay with. And trapping has been around, obviously forever. And in New Mexico, a western state, has said no. And that's one of the areas where Wyoming Game and Fish's director, Brian Nesbitt, he struggled with the idea of persistence hunting when we talked about it. And he said that biologically it doesn't matter. But that he did worry about what something like that, running an animal to exhaustion, would look like to the non-hunting public. He said, ultimately one of his jobs as director is to keep hunting as a management tool in the state. And something like regulating persistence hunting would be tough, but he needed to make sure that people were okay with it, which is why I was out with a game warden once on opening day of pronghorn season, and the deer season was also going on. And he ripped a couple of kids a new one because they had strapped their mule deer buck to the hood of their Jeep and were driving around town with it. And that's not illegal, but it doesn't look good. It was basically on the windshield, like over the windshield wipers of their Jeep. And he said, hey, kids, this looks bad. And this is what gets people upset. And it's what it makes them go to their lawmakers, or their Game and Fish Commission, and start to get more regulations on hunting.
Through all this, you've bumped into a pretty interesting paradox, I think, that we don't always talk about in hunting. And that's this idea that if you limit yourself in a hunt, Mike Wolfe is just a very extreme example of that. But say even just deciding to use traditional archery equipment or using, a traditional flintlock muzzle loader, the more kind of challenge you put on yourself, that obviously gives the animal more of a chance to get away. So that's really promoting fair chase, right? Which is one of the important things in hunting. But that idea doesn't necessarily promote a more clean kill. For example, here's the exact opposite of that. The cleanest, most efficient kill that I've ever made on an animal was a white-tailed doe that was eating out of a corn pile. I was using a crossbow. I was hunting out of a blind. She had no idea that I was there. She was just calmly eating out of a little pile of corn, and seconds later she was dead. Perfectly clean. That is kind of the ultimate in this concept of making a clean kill, making a perfect shot, which is also a very important idea in hunting. But is that scenario really fair chase? Did that deer really have a chance to get away? And how concerned should I be about that? So in other words, if you optimize for a perfectly clean kill, or on the flip side, like Mike Wolfe, if you optimize for a perfectly fair chase, does that start to take away from the other? It
does. Though I'm not sure what the answer is. And honestly, neither does anyone that I talk to.
Trying to put a value on the continuum of fair chase versus a clean kill, I think it's pretty difficult. I think those are things that people, I think those are part of the instinctive nature of people who hunt, and their own personal values and how they grew up and who taught them. So trying to, I think it's difficult to put a right or a wrong on what this person's planning on doing.
So much of it comes down to each hunter's ethics and why he or she is out there. Is it about the excitement of the hunt? Is it about putting meat in the freezer? I would guess that the doe that you shot off of corn was about putting meat in your freezer. And then, I've written stories over the years and talked to so many biologists and managers and icons about when to take a shot and how to know if what you're doing is right or wrong or ethical or not. And when you're in between that area of how much opportunity do I give them to escape, or how much do I want to make sure that it drops the second that I shoot, we all have our own personal lines that we don't cross, or at least should. But if it's in the realm of what's legal, most of the time those lines are between us as individual hunters and our gods, right? They're between us and whoever it is that we talk to in our heads.
Yeah, becomes really complicated. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why, because hunting ethics and our personal views of them are complicated, if that's a reflection of why all of these, state by state hunting regulations are so different and complicated across the country.
Absolutely. And Nesbitt had said that many hunting regulations come from culture, and that is what makes sense. We learn to hunt from our moms or our dads or our mentors, and those are the ethics that stay with us. And when we see something that goes against those ethics, we end up at game and fish meetings or calling lawmakers and arguing our cases. And that's then where regulations change. And a lot of times regulations stay as they are until something like the 50 BMG rifle happens and a warden happens to see it and someone happens to get upset about it, and then it turns into something and it becomes a regulation change. And I absolutely think that's one of the reasons, if you take out just differences in landscape and things like that, that's absolutely why regulations are so different everywhere.
One of the reasons why I like talking to you about all this stuff is because you think about hunting ethics so deeply, and you also think about them in a way that is a little different than the way that I think about them. So in all of your reporting and interviewing folks, did any of your opinions change about hunting ethics and regulations?
That's is a tricky one, because there's the data that I collect and use in reporting as a journalist. And then there's the data that I collect and use and help form my ethics as a hunter. And so my thoughts about my own hunting are always evolving, though they have really clear lines. I have been around hunting and hunting in Wyoming my whole life, though I didn't start hunting until I was an adult. But I've been a reporter covering hunting, fishing, recreation, wildlife, the environment for well over a decade here. And I often see both sides of these ethical conversations. I see where Mike Wolfe is coming from, and I see where those who think it's not okay are coming from. And, as the reporter that covered and wrote this story, I don't know that I had a strong opinion on either side of those. I think it's fascinating to listen to what each side has to say and see what life experiences everybody brings to this. I think it's important for hunters to have these conversations with each other. I'm sure that my thoughts on hunting as a hunter probably have changed a little bit here. I won't do anything differently in the field, but I think it's really important to have these conversations. And the biologists and managers I talk to seem to appreciate diving down this ethics rabbit hole with me, some of them for hours, and they even answered my call when I called back too, so it must not have been awful, because we should all be listening and using this information to help inform our evolving views, right? That's how we keep changing, and in some ways makes the experience of hunting even richer, because we've thought about it more and we've talked to other people about it.
Hey, if you enjoyed this episode of the Outdoor Life Podcast, go find us on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts and subscribe. The Outdoor Life Podcast is edited and produced by Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs, and it's hosted by me, Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson. Reporting in this episode is by contributor Christine Peterson, and the music in this episode is by Lauren Jane Humphrey via APM Music.